No. Hi, I'm John. My presentation is called The Protecting Moon. I wanted to use elements like the moon and the sun in my story because I felt like, I used them a while ago in my studying assignment, but I felt like didn't use them to their full effect, so I thought that this would be another great chance. The background of my story is that my dad does a lot of jobs with me, and whenever he gets to a job site, he always likes to assess the situation, like look at everything visually, find where everything is, and he does this because he tells me that some things have really big consequences, and some things have really small consequences. But if you don't know what the size of the consequence, then why mess with something like that? Um, so here's my story. I lost the sun. Oh, found the sun. Long ago, in a village now forgotten, there was a great king who wanted to build a monument for the sun. And he wanted to do this because the village folk appreciated the light that the sun brought and how it helped their crops grow nice and mighty. So the king sent his men into the forest, and they went, I don't know if you can see it, they went with their wheelbarrows, and they blew them up because they were heavy, and they heaved into the forest. They went into the forest, and they stood beneath the towering great trees with their axes. They put them behind their shoulders, and they swung, crack! And they swung, crack! And they swung, crack! Into the great trees. They fell to the forest floor. They went, and they shook. They shook the forest floor. It trembled. And then, as night fell, the king, he stood from his great tower. He looked about, and he waited for his men to come back. And he saw them coming over the hillside. And they were carrying these big chariots filled with wooden logs. And he looked down at them, and he said, well, that's a lot of wood, but it's not the amount that I want. So what did the king do? He hired more men. And the men that he sent, they went into the forest. They went with their carriages. They heaved them because they were nice and big and mighty. And they went into the forest. And they walked across the forest floor. They picked up their axes. And they heaved them over their shoulders. And they swung at the trees. Crack, swung, crack, swung, crack. And then the mighty trees began to fall. And they shook the forest floor. It trembled. And then the men, they cut up the wood, they put them back in the carriages, they heaved them, and they went back into the village. And the king, he waited right in front of his window. He waited for them to come over the hillside. He looked down at them. He saw the sea of wood that they were carrying. The amount of men that he added helped the amount of wood that was able to be produced significantly. And he looked at them and he said, well, that's a lot of wood, but, it's a monument for the sun. We gotta work faster, people. So what did he do? He got to thinking. He thought, and he was thinking to himself, how could I extend the days? And he looked out of his window. And he looked and he saw the great moon in the sky. And he said, that old stain in the perfect black sky, we can get rid of that. We can extend these days if we keep the sun in the sky, but we remove the moon. So he went to his window, he went to his balcony, and he called down to the village folk and he said, my men, my women, my children, we must banish the moon from the sky. So he began to chant. He said, we hate the moon, we hate the moon. And then the village folk began to chant ahead with them, we hate the moon, we hate the moon. And then the moon, it began to shake in the sky. And the village people kept chanting, we hate the moon, we hate the moon. And the moon began to sink, and it fell out of the sky. And just like that, the sun rose, and it filled the sky, it filled the village with light. The king rejoiced, but his workers, they were so tired. They cried. But the king, he sent them back into the forest regardless. They went into the forest with with their carriages. They picked them up. They went, they were so heavy. They went to the trees. They stood beneath them with their axes. They went crack, crack, crack. And the trees, they fell and they shook the forest floor. And on their way back, the king, he watched from his window again. He looked down at them coming over the hillside. And he said, much better. But his appreciation for the newly found accumulation of wood was interrupted by this hissing sound coming from behind him. And he turned behind him and he saw that a great meteor was falling from the sky. And it was falling towards their village. What do we do? He thought, oh my God, oh my God. And he ducked. He hid himself behind the railing of the outlook that he was standing behind. He just had to sit there. He waited. And then, crash! The meteor broke the village. Screams filled the air. And when it was only screams, when the rumbling was gone, he peeked over and he saw half his village in ruins. He was filled with panic. Oh my God, he thought, oh my God. And he turned out of his window and he turned to the Colosseum half built and he said, oh, it's okay. The Colosseum's still there. So he sent his men back into the forest. They went with their carriages. They went to the trees, they chop, and then the trees fell and they went. And when the men came back, the king stood from his window in front of his half-ruined village, and he said, beautiful, beautiful. But it was interrupted again by a hissing sound. And a meteor, it came from behind, and it went, and it was bigger than the last, and it was soaring straight towards the village. And the king, he didn't know what to do. He began calling out to half of his village, half of what was left, and he said, my people, we need to bring the moon back. So he called and he said, we love the moon, we love the moon. And his village people began to chant, we love the moon, we love the moon. And then the moon, the moon's across the room. This is the moon. It began to rise, and it rose back into the sky, and it protected them from the meteor. The meteor came in, and it bounced off the moon. The moon protected them. And then they realized who they were building the Colosseum for. Not just for the sun, but the moon as well. So that's the end of the story. The moral of the story is that you shouldn't mess with things that you don't know the purpose of. And the reason that this story means a lot to me in the moral is because of the association it has with my dad. Thank you for listening.